Welcome to science class. Today we are going to take a look at how populations grow and what prevents populations from growing indefinitely. Let's review some of the key concepts of evolution and natural selection. Evolution is change over time. That change with regards to organisms happens at the individual level but spreads through the population. Random mutations and the reshuffling of genes during meiosis creates variation in individuals. Most variation is harmless, some of it is harmful, and some of it is beneficial. Any beneficial characteristics that an organism has increases its chances for survival, which in turn increases its chances for reproduction, which in turn causes the population to incrementally shift. Different members in a population will have unique variation, and as those members breed, those variations create new combinations of individuals. Two individuals may have separate genetic differences, which by themselves don't result in any change, but when they combine in their offspring, it has more dramatic effects. Over the next several videos, we will be studying how populations of organisms evolve, but this can lead people to think that something Lamarckian is going on. The peppered moths became dark because they wanted or needed to turn dark. No. The population became dark because the once very rare dark moths had the most offspring, and eventually the population tilted. The moths could have just as easily gone extinct because the mutation that causes dark color was either absent or wasn't common enough. Luckily for them, that's not what happened. The other important aspect of evolution is selective pressure. We call it natural selection because nature selects which traits are good and which traits are bad. The organism doesn't get to decide its fate, except in the case of Homo sapiens to an extent. It's extremely hard to survive. Living organisms have very low entropy compared to their environment, but the laws of physics dictate that entropy must increase. The weather, the amount of food, the air pressure, the amount of water, the amount of sunlight, the elevation, all of these things have to fall into relatively narrow bands for an organism to survive. And most don't. Well, eventually every organism dies, but most don't survive to the point of reproduction. And we know that the vast majority of species that have ever existed have gone extinct. Life is an organized system, but nature is chaotic, and it is a living thing's fate to become part of the chaotic state of nature. That was one of the revelations that Darwin and Wallace had. Another is sexual selection. Sometimes traits are picked for reasons that aren't obviously related to survival, but because mates select them. In the sexual selection video, I gave examples of how the traits that females select can be tied to survival, such as the elk with the largest antlers also likely having the best metabolism and immune system. But other selective strategies might not have anything to do with survival. The ostrich dance, for example. I very seriously doubt this has anything to do with survival, but that doesn't matter because it's still what the females select for. Keeping these ideas in mind will help the next few videos make more sense. In this video, as I said, we're going to be taking a look at how populations grow. Let's get started. Another thing that makes evolution and studying populations tricky is human interference. For one, we don't have an intimate connection with nature. It's hard to imagine how brutal the struggle for existence truly is. We also interfere with natural selection on a scale that basically affects the entire planet. Scientists find traces of our pollution in the eggs of penguins in Antarctica, the most uninhabitable and remote place in the world. There is a cataclysmic extinction event going on right now. Human activity, which removes natural resources, destroys or restructures habitat, pollutes, the use of insecticides, plus the warming of our planet, is causing groups of animals to die and go extinct faster than at any point in history since the dinosaur extinction. Birds, reptiles, amphibians, insects, other mammals, fish, no group is safe. Then there is the introduction of invasive species. We will return to that specific concept later in this video, but to understand populations and natural selection in their purest form, we have to try to imagine nature uninterrupted by humans. Hard to do, but I think we can manage. Right, so animal populations. Organisms have a geographic range. Nature oftentimes selects organisms to succeed in a fairly narrow range. I was going to say organisms evolve to succeed in an environment, but that's not true. That's a Lamarckian view of evolution. Snow leopards didn't evolve thick fur so that they could live in the Himalayas. It's just that the ones who didn't have thick enough fur, plus many other traits, died. Animals don't choose what their traits are. The environment selects the traits that are most likely to survive. The point is, the typical natural range of an organism is fairly concentrated. Sometimes this goes to the extreme. Endemism, think of the word endemic, is when a species is confined entirely to a single geographic location, such as one island or one small region. Lemurs live only in Madagascar. Santa Cruz kangaroo rats live only in Santa Cruz, California. The Texas cave salamander lives only in a single county in Texas. There are species of microbes that only live inside the guts of humans and nowhere else. Ocean-going animals can have planet-wide distributions, but the ecology of the oceans is much more homogeneous than that of land. Some organisms appear to have wide-ranging distributions, but that doesn't tell the whole story. If you look at a map of the geographic range of pigeons, they appear to live everywhere in the world. But there are 175 subspecies of pigeons who are all morphologically different from each other, and each of those subspecies has a much more narrow range. Technically, almost all of these subspecies could breed with each other, but they don't, because they are either separated from each other in the wild, or if their ranges do overlap, one group will not breed with the other. Even in captivity, subspecies oftentimes don't breed because they develop different mating habits. Even though their DNA is totally compatible, they won't breed. Geographic isolation is a major driving force for evolution. The Galapagos Islands contain the only species of iguana that swims, the marine iguana. Many large animals that get isolated on islands shrink. It's called insular dwarfism. There used to be elephants smaller than cattle on the island of Malta. The opposite, insular gigantism, also occurs. New Zealand was home to the Haast's eagle and the moa. The Haast's eagle was twice as massive as the largest eagle today, the harpy eagle. The moa was the only bird that ever completely lost their wings, meaning they only had two appendages, their legs. The largest species of moa completely dwarfed ostriches. They stood 2.6 meters tall and could weigh 230 kilograms. Sadly, we killed all of both of these birds. New Zealand currently has two other flightless birds, the kakapo and the kiwi. So why do species change so much on islands? Well, why are elephants normally so large? Because it's an excellent way to avoid being preyed upon. But it costs elephants huge amounts of energy. When elephants became isolated on Malta, there no longer were large predators, so it became advantageous to not be so huge and have to gather all of that energy, so elephants shrank. For some animals, it is thought that the reason they get larger on islands is because their small size was an adaptation to avoid predators. Once that selective pressure is gone, they tend to grow larger because they can afford to stand out. In the case of the kakapo and the kiwi, perhaps flight became wasted energy because they were safer from predators. Before human interference, New Zealand had no mammalian land carnivores whatsoever. We could do this forever, but I think you get the picture. Organisms have a specific range, and their features are shaped by their habitat through natural selection. Next, we're going to talk about growth rate. The growth rate for any organism may be positive, negative, or stable, and it can be extremely complicated to try and work out exactly why that is. For example, wolves were hunted to extinction within Yellowstone National Park. This was done in an attempt to raise the population of other large mammals, such as bison and elk, but it caused massive parts of the ecosystem of the park to collapse. Elk numbers went up, but the number of almost all other species went down, including trees. After wolves were reintroduced in the 90s, the park recovered in ways that would have been impossible to connect to wolves. Even the shape of the river changed in a healthier way. This is because ecosystems are complex webs where all organisms interact at some level. Wolves don't eat trout, but when the wolves were gone, the elk changed their behavior and started stomping around the area where newly hatched trout grow. So removing the wolves almost caused the trout to go extinct. Under natural conditions, organisms naturally co-evolve and adapt to one another, which ends up forming stable relationships and populations. The coevolution and adaptations that organisms evolve to one another is also why invasive species are so dangerous. The brown tree snake was accidentally introduced to the island of Guam in the 1940s. Before then, snakes had never existed on the island, and none of the other animals had behavioral adaptations for them. As of today, 10 of the 12 native forest bird species of Guam are extinct, and the remaining 2 are classified as functionally extinct. To prove that fear of snakes is a product of evolution, laboratory mice, who live their whole lives in laboratories and only ever see other mice or humans, are still afraid of snakes if you introduce them to one. It is not a learned behavior, it is an evolved behavior. But it is a behavior that can disappear. If a species becomes isolated for many tens of thousands of years, the genetic propensity to fear predators can disappear, as is the case on Guam. So many animals on islands such as New Zealand and Madagascar went extinct shortly after humans arrived because they were so tame from eons of isolation from predators. They were so easy to hunt and exterminate that we caused their extinction. Immigration and emigration does naturally happen. The iguanas of the Galapagos got there somehow. It wasn't by humans. But typically, when a species moves into a new territory, it is close to its former territory, where some ecological overlap exists and some mechanism that prevents it from completely taking over the environment exists. Every environment has a theoretical carrying capacity, which is the maximum number of individuals of a certain species that a particular environment can support. If wolves had never been brought back to Yellowstone, the elk population would at some point have leveled off. The simplest way to think about this is there's only so much food to go around. When new species get introduced to a region, or when the predator of a species disappears, their population tends to increase exponentially, but then it stabilizes. Sometimes before stabilizing, it crashes a bit. Other animals don't plan for the future. They don't truly have that ability. They don't think, well, there's enough food for all of us, but there won't be enough for all of us and our grandchildren. They just eat whatever there is. Primary productivity, which is the rate at which photosynthesizers grow, is one of the key limiting factors that determines the population of any organism. But as I've said, it's more complicated than that. Food sources are shared between species. Maybe there is enough food for the elk population to explode, but they can't use all of it because the buffalo have dibs on some of it. And there's a lot of available food over here, but it's in the wide open, and the wolves will eat us if we go there. Species competing with other species for the same resources limits their population numbers, as does the fact that predators are out to get them. Parasitism and disease are also limiting factors. The fact of the matter is, as a population grows larger, it becomes more likely that they will fall victim to some sort of parasite or disease. It's cruel, but in a way, parasites and disease keep any single population from destroying the ecosystem by letting their numbers get too high. Sometimes the species itself is its own limiting factor. When a species grows too large, they may become stressed to the point where they stop mating or start fighting with one another. The final limiting factor worth mentioning is climate, but I think we understand the role of climate in an ecosystem fairly well. Climate is the #1 factor in determining the rate at which plants grow, the primary productivity. Poor climate leads to fewer plants, leads to less biodiversity, leads to smaller populations. You may find more species of insect on a single tree in the rainforest than you might find total numbers of species of anything in a 10-mile stretch of desert. In the previous video, I mentioned how extinctions open up ecological niches. They do this by removing huge numbers of species. Mammals had existed for millions of years before the dinosaur extinction, but they lived in the shadow of the dinosaurs and other reptiles. Only after dinosaurs, as well as pterosaurs and aquatic reptiles went extinct, could mammals start occupying new niches and developing new populations. Now mammals do fly and swim, and they have diversified into all kinds of sizes and special roles all over the globe. Next time, we are going to begin taking a more focused look at genetics and populations and studying gene pools. Thanks for watching.